Am I on? There we are. Last week, we talked about the desert seasons of life, and this is sort of a carry-on, I suppose. The truth of it is that we all go through certain seasons of life, don't we, that are memorable. Memorable in the sense of them being intensely difficult, stressful times. And while in the middle of it all, there can be a lot of things that will swirl through your mind when you're really kind of going through something. And often some of the things that are swirling through your mind, they're the same kind of questions or thoughts that you think about, or that the questions that you hear, such as like, how will I ever get through all of this? How do I get through this moment here? How will life look like afterward, once maybe if we ever get through to the other side, or when will I ever get through this? When will I ever get through this season? And maybe one of the biggest ones is, will there ever be happiness to be reclaimed when it's all said and done? And these are very real questions, and I'm sure that more than a few of you here know what I'm talking about. I had a memorable season as such in my life that I can remember, and it was and it still is a time that I really don't like to talk about very much. Some of it, but primarily because I handled much of that time, in my opinion, I handled it poorly. And yet, the provision of God that had been given to me had arrived in ways that I never would have expected, and that, when I look back on that, that was a large reason why I had been able to reclaim the joy of the Lord, or the happiness of the Lord, back into my life again. And the year, it was 2005. And there had been a lot of change in our lives during that year. In 2005, we had completed 11 years of youth ministry within a church in Fort St. John. And while we loved youth ministry, after those 11 years, when they were done, we were both just, when I say we, I'm talking Kara and I, were both physically and emotionally spent and drained from it all. And it was a very good 11 years. They really were fun years, fun to think back on. Although the last 2 to 3 years for me were growing increasingly more difficult. They weren't easy years for me. The environment had changed somewhat, and it had become a place of tension. And going into detail really isn't necessary, but there's far more good in it all. But during my last 2 years of that position, I found myself throughout those last 2 to 3 years longing for something different, longing for change, and for an opportunity to do something else outside of ministry. And eventually, or in time, my opportunity, it did arrive. And I was given a job with a company that had contracted out their electrical and instrumentation services, mainly within the oil and gas industry. And so when I resigned from Fort St. John Alliance in 2005, we were then able to take that entire summer off before jumping into new things in what would be late August or early September. Well, the summer took on a very different course than what we had expected, in that my dad suddenly passed away, and it was really great to have that summer off, to have that time with him, and not knowing that it would be our last summer with him. So we were grateful for that time. But when the fall did finally arrive, the newness of another occupation, or a new occupation, accompanied by the mourning that I was going through, those two things did not really make for very good companions with one another. And the new job, it was not turning out as I had expected that it would, and that was more to my fault. I had a perception of the job that was perhaps unrealistic, in expecting that the transition would be smooth, and oil patch, you're going to make bucks. I'm thinking that too, and there would be a lot of time that would be spent in camps in the oil patch, and I didn't spend a ton of time there, but I did spend some, and I found that the time away from home, some of those stretches, I found it hard, and I felt as though at times, as time was moving on through that year, I felt as though I was losing my mind. I didn't know what was going on. Why am I feeling so emotionally all over the place here? And I was wondering, what have I actually got myself into here? And I'm missing everything that my young sons at the time were going through. I'm missing everything that's going on at home. And then there's Kara, too, who is carrying an awful lot as well. And we didn't have the luxury living up there and having family around to be with us, although we had a lot of friends. But sometimes there are just those few friends, those jewels that become as family for us. And it would seem to me that the curse of our age is the busyness of life. I kind of really think that. A lot of busyness gets in the way, and I think a lot of the busyness that disturbs our meaningful relationships, it gets in the way of fostering good, healthy relationships, I think. A lot of busyness is really distracting, isn't it? And I wonder how much of the busyness of life that we all are rolling through and going and working our way through, I wonder how much of that is actually an enemy tactic to foster loneliness or weakness or whatever. But thinking back through it all, there were godsends. We did have some good friends that we remained and still remain connected with after youth ministry, which was and is good. But perhaps for myself, the most unlikely godsend for me had come just before the ground had frozen up in 2005. And that's a significant thing for the oil patch industry. You don't get out into the bush until the ground is frozen, right? Because of all the muskeg and so forth that's up there. And that's when camp life becomes a more prominent part of work life then for those that are involved in it. And the guy that I was partnered up with, that I would be partnered up with, his name was Greg. And I had only met Greg a few times. And he as well had taken much of the summer and, even the fall off. And he came back only a few weeks just before everyone would head off into the bush. And everyone was warning me of this guy Greg. And you got to be careful with him, da-da-da. And it was kind of in a fun way, but there was a certain edge to this fellow too. And eventually, our boss introduced us, and we kind of made our acquaintances, and Greg looked at me, and he said this, knowing a little bit of who I was and where I'd come from, and he said, "So, you're the preacher." And he says, "Well, I'm the devil. Good to meet you," is what he said. And then Greg turns to our boss and he says, don't you worry about whether Tom is going to get along with me. It should be more this, that you should maybe be a little bit more worried of whether I will get along with him. And now Greg was, without question, the crassest fellow that I have ever worked with, ever, like from whenever I've been working. And he was, without question, the crassest guy within that little company. And yet, his heart was far more tender than what I had perceived just within our introductions of one another. And each day as we spent time together, we grew a little more easy with one another. And it was only after a few weeks of working together in that new job and with him, it became quite clear to me quickly that if I was going to make it through that winter, feeling as I did, not understanding what I'm actually going through, misunderstanding the morning that I was actually in, not even really knowing what it was, feeling as I did, inadequate, broken too on the inside, it became clear to me that Greg Terry was going to have a lot to do with my healing and recovery. And we really were a very unlikely pair. And we were referred to endearingly in our little company, and even some who got to know us a little bit, as the preacher and the devil. And Greg Terry became one of my best friends that I have ever had. And I can remember a few things that he had said or would do, mainly say, that made me relax or become a little more at ease just with things. And one morning, I think it was in the morning, we were traveling north, and it was just the two of us in his work truck, and his truck phone rings. And it was Kara wanting to talk to me. And Greg answers the phone, and then he turns his eyes to me, and with this confused look on his face, he says, "Why is my girlfriend calling me on my truck phone asking for you?" His lightheartedness, I don't know, it might not do that for everyone, but it put me at ease, and he always did. And the one thing that he said to me, though, which meant the most to me was knowing that without even saying much, knowing that I was going through a difficult time in life, he sternly and reassuringly said these words: "I'm going to look after you this winter. I'm not going to leave you hanging with anything, with any kind of a job on your own. You will never have to worry about that." And that that was awesome. And when I think back to this time, there are a number of things where God's provision, where I can see God's provision pulling me through a difficult season in life. And some of those things that God provided, the ways in which God provides, Some of them are, they make a lot of sense, a supportive wife. Well, that, you hope that's the way it's going to be, and it was for me, and there's prayers of friends and so forth. But Greg Terry, that was very, very unexpected to me. I did not see anything like that coming. I thought it was very unlikely. We are so vastly different in so many ways, and yet there was a connection where true, genuine friendship was found. The preacher and El Diablo. And it took a difficult season in life for me to become open and receptive toward building a relationship or a friendship with someone as Greg Terry. He was not a personality that I would have been drawn to or would have gravitated toward, but I am so grateful that God brought him into my life. And he helped me get through a time when I was internally asking questions. How am I going to get through this? How am I going to get through this funk? Will I ever be the same again? And am I losing it? Like, am I going to be happy again? And life was never the same again. But happiness has been reclaimed too. God provided, and God never leaves anyone hanging on their own. And there will always be something given. There will always be something provided as a life preserver to grab onto. But sometimes those life preservers might not look like life preservers at all. You might not perceive it. In Genesis 15, we're introduced to Abram and Sarah. And we discover that they're very frustrated. They're frustrated because they cannot have children. And there's some irony in all of this too, isn't there? I mean, in Genesis chapter 15, we're not that far removed from the creation account, are we? And a creation that was teeming with life. And chapter 15 also, it's not that far removed from when God said this, be fruitful and multiply. And here in chapter 15, Abram and Sarah still fall under that very same directive to be fruitful and multiply, yet Sarah is the first person that we come across in the Bible who is unable to have children. She's barren. And I find that interesting. And even more striking is that God said to Abraham that he's going to make him into a great nation. Now, without children, how does such a statement ever become reality? And without thinking too far along into the story, we can say, well, you know what, with God all things are possible. God is going to make something happen for them, right? Like, what's the big deal for God to allow two people to procreate and have children? What's the big deal? Like, God could do that, right? And all Abraham and Sarah would have to do is, pack a picnic lunch and maybe go and spend some quality time together and problem solved, right? But how old was Sarah when she eventually did conceive? We'll just say really old, right? Really old. And how old was Abram? Older than Paul. They were old. They were old. They were old people. And Abram, the statement from God, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Just you watch, you old thing. When we are in the middle of difficult times with questions swirling around within our minds, it's really hard to make sense of how things could ever change or how joy could ever be reclaimed. It's hard to get there or to be confident that the promises of God, that he's going to meet those promises, that he's going to follow through on them. Promises that he makes to us. What kinds of promises? Well, one such as this where he says, I will be with you always. This faith thing. Faith is not for the faint of heart. We have to dig down and really trust. And Abram seemed able to do that. And God said to Abram, fear not, I am your shield, and your reward will be great. And Abram questions that. And he says, I have no heir, I have no descendant, other than Eliezer of Damascus. Really good guy, but he is a consolation heir at best. You have not given me offspring of my own. And so God leads Abram outside of his tent, and he says, you look up at the stars, look at the heavens, and you look at the stars, and you try and count all those stars. The number that you think that you can arrive at, that is going to number the amount of descendants that you have. That is going to number, that is how plentiful your offspring will be. And Abram, looking up at all those stars, considering all that, he was good with that. All right then. and all of the seeming impossibilities, they're still there. But he believed that God would be good to his word, that God would make a way. And when the questions come, will this difficult time, this season, will it ever pass? Will I ever get through this thing? Will I ever have any sense of reclaimed happiness ever again? I think that those kinds of questions have to give way to a larger and more pressing kind of a question, such as, do I really believe that Jesus is here for me? Do I really believe that he will make a way for me? Do I really believe that he's going to see me through this time? Do I really believe that there is joy that is waiting for me, happiness? And do we? Do we believe that God will deliver on his promise to be with us always? To meet the need that longs to be the need that longs to be met within our heart, whatever that need is. Are we confident? Are we confident in his promises? I believe that God always comes through. And some of the experiences and the difficult seasons in life, they're hard to go through. And to this, even to this, Jesus had said that there will be times that are going to be difficult. Everyone will have them. Everyone's going to go through those times. And I do believe that God provides for us everything that we need, and right at the time when we really need it too. But I also think this, that sometimes we miss it. I think it's possible to miss that what God is providing, that we miss it altogether. It's right in front of us, right under our nose sometimes, but yet that provision, it slides past us. Let's take the promise to Abram and Sarah just for an instant. God did make good on his promise to them. They did have a child, they did have an heir, and his name was Isaac, and their descendants did amount the number of stars that could be counted in the night skies too. And when God does something, he does it in a way where only one set of fingerprints can ever be found, and those fingerprints belong to him and him alone. And there's no other person or being that can intervene or stall or prevent the promises of God from coming to fruition or from being realized. God does things in a way where there's only one explanation, and that is God. And he makes a promise to an aging couple who literally have a child, a son. And through this nomadic, unlikely people group that started with Abram and Sarah, God chooses to do something so extraordinary, so unlikely, so grand and so royal, and yet it's lacking in all of the pomp and circumstance. And he works through a people group that had no real home, no real land of their own, and they don't have anything in way of national strength. And they were a people group whose history was filled with one experience after another of being domineered over by more powerful empires and nations. And God makes a promise to Abram to make him into a great nation. And you and I here together today, along with the scores of others who believe as we do, and of all the millions and millions of others who believe and love the Lord who have loved the Lord throughout the centuries and the millennia, all visible proof to that promise. That promise kept to Abram. Because God's promise far exceeded a simple family lineage. It was so much more. And his promise included a spiritual dimension of which you and I are linked to Abraham, to that promise, to God's promise to him. And think about it. God comes to Abram and tells him that he'll make him into a great nation. At what point would anyone see that promise coming to fruition in and around that time? You know, an unlikely couple in Abram and Sarah. And in old age, they have a son, Isaac, and Isaac has a son whose name was Jacob. And those three become, they are known as the patriarchs, as patriarch fathers of the Christian faith. And these three men, their families, this bigger family is just riddled with such messy dysfunction. And when you stop and investigate and look into some of the going-ons of these families, or of this big family, where every commandment of the 10 Commandments is not just challenged, but shattered completely. Murder, adultery, coveting, infighting, you name it. Whatever was sketchy or immoral or background, you look to these families and you're going to find it. You're going to find it all. And if that's not all, eventually this blessing of a great nation had another promise attached to it, to the house of Jacob, specifically to the tribe of Judah, which was one of the sons of Jacob, Judah. That God's Messiah would be of the lineage of Judah. And we talked about Judah a few weeks ago. This is what we know of Judah, just real quick. Judah conceived a child with his daughter-in-law. Unknowingly, he thought his daughter-in-law was a prostitute. But how is that for messianic lineage right there? A lineage that's filled with scoundrels, a lineage that's filled with rascals, but there were some real honorable and noble men and women too. But what a lineage. It had it all. And God chooses to work through all these kinds of circumstances, the messiness and the muck and the mire. And from it all, he does something so grand and so otherworldly that no other human being could ever be credited with orchestrating events such as that. I'll make you into a great nation. And then years later, a young teenage girl by the name of Mary enters this story of promise. A young girl who dared to believe that the angel who met with her was a divine messenger sent from God, with a message that she would conceive God's own son supernaturally. She dared to believe that it was true. And she dared to believe that regardless of how impossible or how unnatural or how far out there that promise seemed to be, that promise from God, it could be counted as gospel still. God's word is true. And nothing stands in the way of God fulfilling his promises. Nothing. Luke 13. Jesus is kind of told to scram, right? He's told to get away, if you remember what Michaela had read. It says, they tell him, you better leave. The Pharisees are telling Jesus to run. Just like, listen, you better get going. You're on Herod's radar here. And he is going to end your life. And Jesus never wavered. He was on his way to Jerusalem. This is just before Holy Week. He's on his way to the cross here. And there is only one direction he intended to travel, and that was in the direction toward Jerusalem, to the cross. And he had no fear of Herod. And he says, you tell Herod that I cast out demons and perform cures today, tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course. In other words, Herod is not the authority here. Herod cannot alter the plan of God. Herod cannot stop the love of God. And nothing can stop the love of God from finding you or I. Regardless of where we find ourselves or what situation or circumstances we find ourselves in, regardless of how insurmountable or how daunting they look, God's promise will always be kept. I will be with you always. And that promise, it might arrive on the doorstep of your life in a way that is completely unexpected, or in a way that you just would never have perceived. But his promise will be kept. It will be true. It was for Abraham and Sarah. It was for Mary. And in each moment, though, it required faith that dares to trust, that dares to take a step forward with an open heart and an open mind to find the hand of God, reaching out with what we need, and finding the peace that brings us to a place of reclaimed happiness. God delivers. God's promises are sure, and he keeps them all. And so what do? We search our hearts, right? We search our hearts and we look to God. God, show me, show me. So in conclusion, let's sing that song, that great hymn, Search Me, O God.